Okay, so we are now on step 8, evaluating arguments, and we're working on example number 10. And this is our longest, most complicated argument. So what I've done is opened up two Word documents so that I can write the evaluation of the argument over here, including some pre-writing. Let me make that a little bit bigger so that we can see it. And then we can go sort of back and forth between the argument and the evaluation. But see this. Now, if you remember from our previous steps, if you saw any of those, this is an argument claiming that it is acceptable to boo sometimes at sports events. And the structure of the argument is pretty clear. And numbered in this case, the author gives us, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 8 situations in which the author believes that it's acceptable to boo people, from owners, officials, to athletes. And so there's a lot of detail in this argument and a lot to say about it. Let me make some pre-writing notes. Several of the claims rest on the assertion that certain individuals, owners, officials, politicians, expect to be booed, and therefore booing is okay. This seems quite wrong. Just because behavior is expected doesn't mean it is justified. Okay, that one point is going to speak to this paragraph here. 4. Again, let me make that a little bigger so you can see it. Sitting politicians. Okay, they're insulated. They can. It sort of comes with it. Owners. If you can see this, 2. If you put your ego in the face of a franchise, you should be able to take what comes with it. That means it's okay. I'm going to disagree with that. Current broadcasters and officials, both of these are going to be criticized on that point. So that's already going to knock off in one paragraph. I can just say all of them are like that. All of those claims are functioning similarly, and that's already going to be a pretty big critique. Now, up here in the beginning of the argument, there's this claim which basically says, look, athletes have gotten away with it. No one's limited them. But if we boo them, they'll grow up to be healthier. They won't be such maladjusted narcissists. That's just dubious to me. It doesn't seem to me that booing is the key element that is missing in terms of how professional athletes act out. So let's put that down in our pre-writing. Author also claims that booing will keep athletes from becoming maladjusted narcissists. This seems unlikely. Okay, I'm going to develop that point. Here, it's a little bit different. And although these are related, these two paragraphs are related. One says, cheating's really bad. Let us, as fans, express how bad it is because it's really harmful to the sports. Good. And 3, other people don't discipline these athletes, schools, and leagues, and we should if we don't want them to have these huge salaries without any accountability for their actions. So in that sense, booing may be acceptable. Now, what do I think about those arguments? It seems to me that the claim that fans should be able to express their disapproval of actions that undermine sports seems appropriate. After all, fans have a significant investment in keeping sports honest. So cheating does in fact undermine the sport and fans' potential pleasure in it. So that's like, oh, okay, that seems to make sense. Now, what about the question of discipline? It seems to me that again, it's not appropriate to have the fans step in where the officials, parents, league won't. Fans don't have the responsibility of disciplining individual players. So it seems to me that when I'm thinking about the argument and making this point up here, I'm saying, you know what, that really is appropriate for fans to express their disapproval. But here, I'm going to make a different point saying it's really not appropriate for fans to discipline. So any claim that like, oh, someone else is not doing the discipline, therefore the fans should, is not really going to work. I've seemed to have addressed the main parts of the argument. Certainly enough that I think I've really weakened it. That the author, I'm going to say the author really hasn't shown that there are significant cases where booing is acceptable. So this argument, I believe, is going to fail. Let's start writing the evaluation now that I have some idea of what I want to say. This argument attempts to persuade the reader that it is acceptable, that is to say, ethically justified, to boo at sporting events, at least under certain circumstances. The author then lists many of those circumstances. However, the argument fails to persuade me that those circumstances actually do constitute acceptable opportunities for fans to boo. For example, the author claims that several public roles, namely the roles of team owners, current broadcasters who used to be members of a rival team, politicians. I'm going to change my writing here. I don't like that. I don't like the roles. It seems awkward. Figures, politicians, and officials should expect to be booed by virtue of their job or role. However, the mere fact that a public figure can expect certain behavior on the part of the public does not justify that behavior. Nationally elected politicians, for example, probably should expect to receive death threats over the course of a career. That such threats are not surprising does not mean that they are ethically justified. In the same way, these figures may expect to be booed, but the predictability of the booing does not justify it. So I just really critiqued multiple claims that the author is using. Now let's go on to another point. Another main element of the author's argument concerns discipline. The author may be quite correct that leagues and coaches do not sufficiently discipline athletes for off-the-field misbehavior. However, the fact that they do not fulfill their responsibility does not mean that the fans ought to take that responsibility up. The fans have no jurisdiction over the athletes, and their job is not to discipline them. I'm going to segue to the next point. The job of the fans, however, is to enjoy the sport. And their enjoyment becomes impossible in the context of cheating and other forms of just of cheating. I think that's really what the author's trying to, in the context of cheating. The author rightly points out the harm of cheating and correctly states that the fans should have the right to express their disapproval of such reprehensible behavior. Whether they should express that disapproval in the form of booing, however, is questionable. Perhaps they should choose a more effective, productive means of communicating their perspective. That question aside, it seems appropriate that booing is at least one option that fans can utilize to express their dismay at behavior that threatens to undermine a central aspect of sport itself. Of all the scenarios that the author presents as justified examples of booing, only this one is compelling. Technically, it is enough to support the fairly weak, I was heading towards using the word conclusion, the fairly limited scope of the author's point, which is merely that it is sometimes acceptable to boo. But the fact that the author has only come up with one justified situation, one situation that justifies booing, indicates that the argument is quite weak overall. And I want to go back, because I did a lot of my thinking while I'm writing, so I want to go back and just make sure I'm being consistent. Here's where I'm making my judgment. Let's make that a little bit bigger. The argument lists many of the circumstances. However, the argument fails to persuade me that those circumstances actually do constitute acceptable opportunities for fans to boo. After doing my thinking, I realized that one of them I was persuaded by. So let me change that a little bit. That most indeed only one of the ones mentioned by the author seems to be justified. So I'm just going to putting a hint in here that I'm going to come back to saying all of them are wrong except one. Now I back that up with some evidence here. The author claims this, but that doesn't work. Discipline, that doesn't work. And then I go back to what I do agree with, that, well, the fans have a right to expect to enjoy the sport, and cheating undermines their ability to enjoy the sport. Therefore, it's appropriate, given the stakes involved, that they should express their disapproval. And then I return to this point, and I'm emphasizing the scope of the conclusion here. And I say, well, yeah, technically maybe this author has met the standard, but the fact that out of all the situations that the authors mentioned, I'm only persuaded by one indicates that it's a pretty weak argument. Okay, so that's the evaluation, which we can almost see in its entirety, but not quite, of this argument. Because so many of the premises made the same mistake, it's actually not that long of a evaluation, because I could handle multiple premises in the exact same way and at the exact same time. Sometimes you may have to write quite a bit more in order to do a sufficiently detailed job. But that's a good example of step 8 done on a longer, more complex argument.